Hey guys, this is part 8 of the Create a WhatsApp Web Clone with Appwrite and Vue.js. In this video we're going to be creating the Appwrite function which calculates our contacts, as well as updating the group creation flow to allow for easier adding of your contacts to a new group. So let's jump right into things. So the way we're going to achieve this is every time we create a new group and add the members to the group, we're going to execute an Appwrite function. So let's go to our code and create a new Appwrite function. So Appwrite init function. This is going to be called calculate contacts. It will have a unique ID, node, and there we go, it is created. Something that's a bit annoying that we have to do, but you know, we got to do it. Unless they actually fixed it. Let's find out if they fixed it first. The first thing we want to do is just copy the variables over to here. And let's deploy, Appwrite deploy function. Let's try this out actually. And we're going to want to deploy the calculate contacts. Let's take a look at our functions. So we now calculate contacts. I want to see if the variables got deployed. Oh, they did, which means that they fixed it. Awesome. So essentially, like I just did over there, you just want to copy the variables over from our add members function to our calculate contacts function. We're going to want to create execute any, because we want anyone to be able to execute this. And we're also going to want to trigger this on a specific event. So first of all, let's go to our settings. And we want it to execute on the memberships create event. And we want it to be for all teams and all memberships. Okay, so let's add this event. And what we're going to want to do now is just copy this team's whatever membership thing. We want to copy the event and just paste that into our appwrite.json into events. So string. And let's redeploy this now. Appwrite deploy function. Calculate contacts. Yes. And now that it's deployed, just do a quick refresh to make sure everything is here properly. We have our any, we have our team's memberships, and all is well. Okay. If we go to our API keys, we're going to need to create a new API key for this. We're going to need to give it access to the database. So we want to give it teams read, which will allow us to read the teams. We want documents read and documents write, and this will allow us to read and write from the database, and we'll just call this calculate contacts and create. Just show the secret and copy it over to our Appwrite.json and replace the old function key with function API key. And let's just deploy one more time. Calculate contacts and enter. Seems like there's like a ghost restart visual code, whatever. And yes. And now that we've redeployed it, everything should be working in this function. So let's now go to the code for this function. So if we see we have our calculate contacts, we're going to want to edit it to allow it to work for us. So the first thing that we need is we only need the teams and database SDK. So let's just remove that. Let's remove that. Let's remove all that. And the next thing I just want to do is, so I can get autocomplete, is go into cd functions calculate contacts and npmi. That's just to install the node Appwrite package. Now that that's done, we're going to want to get our team ID. So the const team ID is equal to json.parse. And we want rec.variables. And this is going to be Appwrite function event data. And since we're triggering this from an event, so we don't actually use the rec variables payload like it says over here. Sorry, the rec.payload. We want to use rec variables and then the Appwrite function event data and dot team ID. Cool. once we have the team ID, we're going to say const memberships is equal to await teams dot list memberships for the team ID. And this is the way we get the memberships for the team ID. Cool. And then we want to extract all the user IDs from these memberships. User IDs is equal to memberships dot map membership, and then we want membership dot user ID. User ID. Cool. Now we want to map over all these user IDs. For each user ID, we want to go over all the memberships and then create the contact relation between the two. So let's say we want await promise that all settled. The reason you're using all settled is because occasionally you may reject if it violates the unique constraint that we placed on it between the user ID and the contact ID. So all settled will fix that for us. Then we want to user IDs dot flat map user ID, and in here we want to return memberships dot map. So basically this is a way of saying for each user ID for each membership. So we have a membership, and okay, so if the membership dot user ID is equal to the current user ID, we don't want to create a relation between the user and himself. So we're just going to return promise dot resolve. Cool. And otherwise we want to return database dot create document, and we want the WhatsApp database ID. If we look over here in our database section, so you can see here that, let's go to the database, database settings. You can see our database ID is WhatsApp. And if you go to our collection contacts, so you can see that the collection ID is contacts, and that's why I named the collection as opposed to unique ID, since it's easier to just remember that. So we would say we create the document, and then we want to go to the collection ID, which is contacts. We want the document ID to be SDK.ID.unique. Then we want the document to be user ID is equal to the user ID. The contact ID is equal to the membership dot user ID. And the contact, and then the email, the email is going to be equal to the membership dot user email. Okay, so we create that document, and the last thing we need is the permissions for this. So all we really need to put here is SDK dot permission dot read, and then SDK dot role dot user, and then user ID. And let's just explain this for a second. So essentially, if we look at this object, well, this is the database ID, the collection ID. This is our way of telling Appwrite to create a unique ID for this document. This object over here is essentially the row or the document. If you look at our attributes, we have user ID, contact ID, and email. So we have user ID, contact ID, email. It's our way of creating the row. And the permission over here is to say that who has permission to read this document. And it's the person whose contact we're identifying. So user ID of X has a contact of Y, so the only person who's able to read this row is user ID of X. Cool. And now that that is done, we're going to turn res.json, and let's just say success true. And that is done for this function. So if we go back a second and say Appwrite deploy function, and we want to deploy the calculate contacts, and yes. Cool. And if we just try this out, if we go to our functions, just make sure that it is built. So it's building, and it's ready. So if we go to authentication and go to teams, let's just say group 3, we're going to add a new member, test@gmail.com, and let's not make him an owner, and add member. So we say the user added successfully. If we go to our functions, we should see in our logs that this is now processing, and we get success true. So if we go to our database now, WhatsApp, contacts, we should see now that we have the documents. And if we look at the IDs, we have the user ID, which starts with 633 and ends with E0. So you see we have 1, 2 that have that user ID. Each of these have a different contact ID, right? This ends with 9AC, this ends with ACA. And this is essentially our way of saying, okay, this is each person's contact. This will make a little bit more sense once we go to our front end and actually render out this list of contacts. So if we go to our front end, you'll see the place where we want to use this is we want to use it when instead of typing in a contact name, I also want to see a list of my contacts. So let's actually create that now. So we're going to need to do that in the sidebar over here. So let's close this all up, source, components, sidebar, and we're going to want to create a component called contact list.view. And over here, we're going to want to put in our standard stuff. We're going to want to have the template, and we're going to want to have our script setup lang equals ts. Okay, so before we do this, we're going to be putting this into the new group participants sidebar. So let's just import that in here at the bottom. So right before our closing main tag, we just want to put in our contact list. Cool. Let's just import that. Nice. Okay, so we're going to now need to get our contacts. So let's create a function in source API, create a new thing called database. .ts. This is where we're going to be creating our functions which communicate with the database. So the first thing we need to do though is we want to create our const databases. This is in the API index ts is equal to new databases, and we need the client, and we're going to need the database ID. So we're going to actually put that in our config, and we're going to say const database ID is equal to WhatsApp, and we're going to export this. And that way, from here, we're just going to say database. Database. Did I spell that wrong? In config data, yeah, I did. Database ID. Back in our index, we want database ID, and we're going to export this as well. And then from our database.ts, we're going to export an interface of contact, which is essentially going to be how the contact looks, the data structure. It's going to have a user ID, which is a string. It's going to have a contact ID, which is a string. And it's going to have an email, which is a string. All right. Then we're going to export an async function called getContacts, which will accept a user ID. And then it's going to return a promise and a list of contacts. Cool. So we want to return databases.list documents. Well, we have to import this first. Databases.list documents. Now, which documents in which collection? So we have the collection ID. So let's add this to our config file and say const collections is equal to, and we're going to say the contacts collection has an ID of contacts. Let's just change this to singular, collection.contacts, and we're going to export that, and we're going to import it from here, collection.contacts. We're going to want to create a query where query.equal, and this auto imports from Appwrite, the user ID property, user ID on that document is equal to user ID. Okay. Right, so just complaining because this return value does not equal the contact. Then we have the result, and we're going to return the result .documents.map doc, and we're going to basically return the user ID, which is going to be equal to doc.userid, the contact ID, which is the doc.contact ID, and the email is equal to doc.email. Okay, we just need to add a comma here, and that is all for this function. So now if we go to our new group info, sorry, not new group info, if we want to go to the participants, we want to basically get the contacts and render them out. So let's go to the group. So we're here. We basically want to say here unmounted. We want to do something. So the first thing that we need is to get the current user's ID. So the way we do that is by using the Appwrite session API. So we're going to say, first let's actually create the refs for this. So we want to say const session is equal to ref, and the ref of session is going to be the models.session, models.session. Let's import this session, or undefined because the user may somehow be not logged in, and it will start off as undefined. And the second thing we need is const contacts is equal to a ref of contact, and I may have not exported that, so let's go to our database. No, I did export it, so we want to basically say export, so just import it. So import contact from API database. So now we have contact. This will be an array of contacts, and it'll start off as an empty array. Cool. In our onMounted, let's just import that as well. So copy and paste that into the Vue import. So over here, what we want to do is essentially say the session.value is equal to await account, which comes from Appwrite, which we're going to have to import as well. Did we not export it ever? I think we did. We have account exported here, so that should work. So we're just going to import account from //API. And now if we go back here, account dot get session current. So this gives us the current session. And then if session.value, meaning that there is a user, we want to say contacts.value is equal to await get contacts. Not sure why this doesn't auto import anymore. Await get contacts, so I'll just paste that in over here. We await get contacts for the session dot value dot user ID. or an empty array. Okay, cool. So now that we have contacts, we're going to go to our contact list component and say that our interface of props is equal to contacts, which will be an array of these contacts. And we're going to need to create a contact item component. This is very similar to what we did with the chat list and the chat item. So the contact item.view. This will also have a template which will have a script setup lang equals ts, and this will just have a list of those contact items. Okay, fine. So I'm gonna leave this off for now. Let's just do one last thing before we call it a day. In our contact list, we just want to put contacts is equal to contacts, and that way he's happy now. And essentially we're just going to be able to render out the list of contacts, and when we click on it we want to add that as an email. So if we look over here, so instead of manually typing in the contact name and pressing enter, we're going to basically render out the list of contacts we have. When I click it, it will add it to this group. So that's all for this one. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.